from the official program, Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba rose to deliver a tirade against Belgium, denouncing at length the terrible suffering and exploitation that the Congolese people had experienced under Belgian colonial rule. Lumumba's speech was warmly applauded by the Congolese present, but the Belgians were outraged and King Baudouin was not amused. In delivering this speech, Patrice Lumumba merely confirmed the suspicions of the Belgian government that he was an enemy of Belgian interests in the region. Just 6 months later, Patrice Lumumba was imprisoned and tragically murdered aged only 35. This is the story of Patrice Lumumba, an African hero and Congo's first prime minister whose reputation inspired hope for independence throughout Africa in the 20th century. A tall, thin man with lots of charisma and great oratory powers, but a volatile temperament, Patrice Emery Lumumba was born in Kasai province in the Congo in 1925. The young boy began attending missionary schools at age 11. Most missionary schools' primary objective was to prepare Africans for manual labor, and only 1 hour per day was given to actual study, with the rest dedicated to farming and other physical work. But Patrice Lumumba was different. His teachers at the missionary responded to his deep desire for knowledge and his inquisitive nature by lending him books to read before dark, as his family was too poor to afford a candle for him to read by. Patrice Lumumba was known for being a vocal, precocious young man, and his outspoken nature would come to define his life and career. Growing up, the young Lumumba was told about the horrific tales of atrocities committed in the Congo at the hands of Belgian soldiers under King Leopold II. King Leopold II had ruled the territory as his fiefdom, and he employed the explorer Henry Morton Stanley as his agent. Leopold II exploited the Congo with such ruthless brutality that, following the revelations of endless mutilations and other atrocities, the Belgian parliament finally, in the year 1908, deprived him of control and turned his territory into a colony. Anyways, Patrice Lumumba left school at age 18, and it has been suggested that it was because his father could no longer afford school fees. After leaving school, he went in search of work, first to Kindu, a mining town, then to Kalima, where he worked as a nursing assistant. In 1944, Patrice Lumumba set out for Kasai's second largest city, Stanleyville, now Kisangani. In this big city, Lumumba was dazzled by the cosmopolitan and European areas, its wide boulevards, swimming pools, skyscrapers, and luxurious villas. However, the city's restaurants, theaters, and hotels were off-limits to Africans who were relegated to the backseats of buses and boats and were not permitted to live within city limits. While Lumumba was unable to take advantage of many of the city's amenities, he was able to use the township library in Mangobo where he lived. Lumumba took a course to improve his French and learned several Congolese languages, including Swahili, as well as the Lingala language. In 1947, because he was fluent in Congolese languages, Patrice Lumumba got a job as a postal worker in the capital city of Leopoldville, nearly 1,000 miles down the Congo River, but he was transferred back to Stanleyville in 1950. Back in Stanleyville, Lumumba surrounded himself with Congolese intellectuals. Together, this group of intellectuals debated issues, listened to the news on the radio, and exchanged books. In the early 1950s, Lumumba began expressing himself in editorials and poems he wrote for Voice of the Congo and La Croix du Congo, two Evolue publications. The Evolue were the upper strata of the middle class, the highest level indigenous Congolese could attain in the Belgian colony. Through these writings, Patrice Lumumba became known as one of only a dozen Congolese in a country of 13 million who dared to express himself. Patrice Lumumba became an Evolue in 1954 at a time when he believed in Western values and had not yet become critical of Belgian colonialism. In 1955, when King Baudouin of Belgium and his minister for the colonies visited the Congo, Lumumba's prestige rose when he had talks with them. The king drew Patrice Lumumba aside to discuss the future of the Congo. However, his newly found status made him bitter enemies among both the Belgian administrators and some locals in the Congo. As a result, from 1956 onwards, the colonial administration kept him under constant surveillance. In 1956, the young Lumumba was invited by the government to visit Belgium for a study tour, but on his return to the Congo, was arrested on charges of embezzlement. This alleged embezzlement of funds had taken place when he worked in the post office. There is a general belief, however, that these charges against Patrice were trumped up. The authorities were determined to get him out of the way, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Fortunately, the Minister of the Colonies reduced this sentence to 1 year. Patrice Lumumba's term in prison served only to enhance his reputation in the eyes of the nationalists. While in prison, Lumumba considered his status as an evilware and made a radical shift towards Pan-Africanism and Congolese nationalism. The notion of nationalism enabled different ethnic groups that made up the Congolese society to come together and fight against colonial economic exploitation, political repression, and cultural oppression. Upon his release, Patrice Lumumba moved to the capital, Leopoldville, where he worked as a salesman for a local brewery. Political activity in Leopoldville at the time was beginning to stir. News of Ghana's independence in 1957 and the growing momentum in neighboring French colonies towards African rule provided a new stimulus for the people in the Congo to fight colonialism. The first organized movement came from a tribal organization called Abako. Abako was originally founded by Bakongo leaders to promote use of the Kikongo language, but the organization now began to make overt political demands. Abako's leader, Joseph Kasavubu, set his sights on reuniting the Bakongo people divided by the boundaries of the Belgian Congo, the French Congo, and Angola. Joseph Kasavubu also sought to rebuild the old Congo kingdom that had last flourished in the 16th century. Abako established a strong political base among the Bakongo living in Leopoldville and the Lower Congo region. Another party later appeared, and it was called Konakat. The party was led by Moise Chombe, a shrewd politician who was the son of a wealthy businessman from Katanga. Konakat favored provincial autonomy for Katanga and worked closely with Belgian groups pursuing the same interests, and also advocated continuing ties with Belgium. Patrice Lumumba chose a different path. In 1958, he joined a group of other young evilwares to launch the Congolese national movement, the MNC, to rally support on a national basis. Only Lumumba's MNC stood out as a champion of Congolese nationalism. It was the first all-Congolese political party based not on ethnicity or based on region, but for the entire country. One very important encounter for Lumumba was when, along with 2 companions, he was allowed to travel to Accra, Ghana in December of 1958 to attend the All-African People's Conference. At the conference, Patrice had the privilege to address the crowd gathered. As a number of other African nationalists pushing for political independence listened, Lumumba declared, "The winds of freedom currently blowing across all of Africa have not left the Congolese people indifferent. Political awareness, which until very recently was latent, is now becoming manifest and assuming outward expression, and it will assert itself even more forcefully in the months to come. We are thus assured of the support of the masses and of the success of the efforts we are undertaking." Like other delegates that were present at the conference, Patrice Lumumba returned home burning with enthusiasm for the struggle against colonial rule and determined to build the MNC into a mass political movement along the lines of Kwame Nkrumah's CPP. Patrice Lumumba was now hell-bent on fighting for Congolese independence. In January of 1959, the city of Leopoldville was torn by vicious rioting. The immediate cause of the violence was a decision by the local authorities to refuse permission for Kasavubu's Abako to hold a scheduled Sunday afternoon meeting. But further investigations by the Belgians revealed that unemployment, overcrowding and discrimination had produced a groundswell of frustration and discontent amongst the masses. And so, to help quell the discontent, the Belgian government announced a program of political reform, starting with local government elections. The colonial government also added a vague promise about independence as being the eventual goal of Belgian policy. However, many people felt that these reforms were not enough. More radical nationalists denounced these plans as being too slow and called for a boycott of the proposed municipal and rural elections. Well, the Belgians did not take this lying down, and their repression followed. Belgian repression peaked on 30 October 1959. When the forcible dispersion of an MNC rally in Stanleyville led to the death of 30 people. Thereafter, Patrice Lumumba was imprisoned on a charge of inciting riots. Following all of this, Congo descended into chaos. There was disorder and violence in other key areas of the country, and the Belgian authorities found it difficult to suppress. Over the next few months, the Congolese felt empowered to resist. They tested the Belgian administrators, daring them to punish the colonized people. In the Lower Congo, the Bakongo refused to pay taxes and to abide by the administrative regulations. More disturbances occurred in Stanleyville, and when King Baldwin visited the city in December of 1959, the mob of demonstrators that greeted him at the airport had to be dispersed with tear gas. Pressure was increasingly piling on Belgium, and so it felt obliged to hasten the process of independence for the Congo. A conference was convened for all Congolese political parties, and they were to meet in Brussels in January of 1960. Lumumba's MNC refused to take part without him being present, and it was soon obvious to the Belgians that the conference would not succeed without Lumumba being there. And so Patrice Lumumba was released from prison and he arrived in Brussels on 26 January 1960. At the conference, only Patrice Lumumba insisted upon a single Congo, while Moise Tshombe, whose power base was the mineral-rich Katanga province, proposed an independent Congo made up of a loose federation of semi-autonomous provinces. At this conference, provincial and national elections were set for May of 1960, with Congo eventually gaining independence in June of that year. The elections themselves were a true testament of how divided the Congo was. Of the 137 seats that were up for grabs on the National Assembly, the PSA party won 13 seats, Kasavubu's Abako with 12 seats, Konakat with 8, and Lumumba's MNC with a majority of 33 seats. The rest of the seats went to over a dozen smaller parties. Lumumba tried unsuccessfully to unite with Tshombe's Konakat, as did Kasavubu. Finally, on 23 June 1960, Patrice Lumumba and Joseph Kasavubu allied to form a unified government of Congo, with Kasavubu as president and Lumumba as prime minister. On Independence Day, attended by the King of the Belgians, King Baldwin, the new Prime Minister, Lumumba, considered himself and the Congolese people as being utterly disrespected when he was not scheduled to speak at the formal ceremony handing over power on 30 June 1960. Following the patronizing speech by King Baldwin that I alluded to earlier, in which he praised Belgium's great civilizing mission in the Congo, Lumumba defied protocol and made a radical speech in reply, in which he castigated the brutality and injustice of Belgian rule in the Congo. In his independence speech, Lumumba also said, and I quote, "We are going to show the world what the black man can do when he works in freedom, and we are going to make of the Congo the center of the sun's radiance for all of Africa. We are going to keep watch over the lands of our country so that they truly profit her children." The official lunch which followed the ceremony was delayed for 2 hours, while King Baldwin and his ministers debated whether to boycott it and fly back at once to Belgium. When the lunch eventually took place, it was cold and disorganized. The country that Lumumba and Kasavubu inherited was by any standard ill-prepared for independence. Except at a local level, no Congolese had acquired any experience of government or parliamentary life. In the top ranks of the civil servants, no more than 3 Congolese out of an establishment of 1,400 held posts, and 2 of those had been recently appointed. Moreover, prior to the handover of government authorities, the Belgians had produced a new constitution that assigned to 6 provincial governments the same competencies as those of the central government. This arrangement was an invitation for an immediate power struggle between the provinces and the central government. And for sure, such a power struggle duly erupted within days of the country's independence. The honeymoon for Congo and for Patrice Lumumba, if he even had any, was short-lived. It was only a few days after independence before the first disaster struck. Here, among the ranks of the Force Publique, the Congo's army, resentment over low pay and lack of promotion had been simmering for months. The soldiers contrasted their own dire living conditions and bleak prospects with the sudden wealth and influence of civilian politicians, former clerks and salesmen, who were now driving around in large cars and spending money freely. The members of the Force Publique were also not happy with the slow rate of Africanization or lack thereof that was taking place in this army. While the government was run by Congolese, the army remained under the control of the same 1,100 strong Belgian officers. The command of the Force Publique, General Emile Janssens, only made this situation worse. The general was adamant that there would be no acceleration in the Africanization program. After an incident of indiscipline at an army barrack in Leopoldville on 4 June, General Janssens summoned officers and men on duty at army headquarters and lectured them on the need for absolute obedience. To make his point clear, he wrote on a blackboard the following words: "Before independence is equal to after independence." In response, the soldiers held a protest meeting in the army camp that night, demanding the dismissal of General Janssens. This ended up in a riot. Troops at another garrison were ordered to intervene, but they mutinied and went on a rampage, attacking European civilians. Congo was in crisis. Prime Minister Lumumba had to act, and he publicly accused Belgian officers of fomenting rebellion. He then dismissed General Janssens and other senior officers. In subsequent negotiations with the army, Lumumba decided that the entire officer corps should be replaced by Congolese. Prime Minister Lumumba also appointed Victor Lundula as the new army commander, and as chief of staff, Lumumba chose his trusted personal aide, one Joseph Mobutu, who had spent 7 years in the Force Publique working mainly as a clerk, rising to the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest rank open to Congolese. Amid this war chaos, thousands of Europeans, primarily Belgians, fled, and stories of atrocities against white people surfaced in newspapers around the globe.
Streaming into the little town of Kitwe in northern Rhodesia, just across the border from the Congo, come the refugees, with whatever they could bring, and often bearing marks of the trouble they had getting away. Further north, at the frontier post of Kasumbalesa, families arrive by car and on foot, and even the children are armed.
The great mineral wealth of the Congo meant that a number of Western nations, including the former colonial power Belgium, Britain and France, as well as the United States with the principal motive of Cold War strategy, were not prepared to lose these vast resources, and so they had to act fast. The Belgian government at first tried to persuade Lumumba to permit Belgian troops stationed in the Congo to restore order. But when Lumumba refused, the Belgians unilaterally ordered their forces into action and arranged to fly in reinforcements. As their troops took control of key points like Leopoldville Airport, Patrice Lumumba became convinced that Belgium was trying to reimpose its rule. Well, on 11 June 1960, the crisis escalated even further. With the connivance of Belgium and support of Belgian mining and commercial firms, the Katanga leader Moise Tshombe grasped the opportunity of the chaos to declare Katanga an independent state. Belgian troops were used to disarm and expel Congolese army units from the province. The main purpose of this mission and arrangement was to insulate the province from the disorder and apparent militant nationalism sweeping the rest of the Congo, as well as to safeguard the Western investment there. The Belgians were also intent on using Katanga as a base from which to establish a pro-Belgian government in Leopoldville. Desperate for help, Patrice Lumumba appealed to the United Nations to help restore order and maintain the integrity of the Congo by preventing Katanga's secession. The United Nations also faced a formidable task, and although it acted swiftly, it was unable to prevent the immediate cessation of Katanga. In an increasingly volatile mood, Patrice Lumumba demanded that the United Nations force be used to expel the Belgian troops. Lumumba issued an ultimatum threatening that if the United Nations did not remove all Belgian troops from the Congo by midnight on 19 July, then he would invite the Soviet Union to intervene. Now, you have to understand that this was at a time when the Cold War rivalry was at one of its peaks. And so Lumumba's threats infuriated the United States and pushed the Congo into the middle of a Cold War confrontation. United States officials feared the possibility of a communist takeover in Congo similar to Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution in 1959. They feared that this would provide the Soviet Union with a base in the heart of Africa. Lumumba's nationalism was seen by the West as a threat to its strategic interests in the region, not least because of the country's enormous mineral wealth encompassing as it did copper, diamonds, rubber, uranium and cobalt. In 1958, the Congo produced 50% of the world's supply of uranium, most of which was purchased by the United States. It also produced 75% of the world's cobalt and 70% of its industrial diamonds. Belgian troops were eventually withdrawn from the Congo, but Lumumba issued new demands, insisting that the United Nations troops be used to end the cessation of Katanga by force if necessary. When United Nations officials made clear to him that their mandate did not include interfering in the Congo's internal conflicts and that they wanted a negotiated settlement in Katanga, Lumumba reacted in fury, accusing the United Nations of collaboration with Belgium. Key UN officials came to share the United States and the Belgian view that Lumumba was too erratic and irrational to be trusted. On 15 August, seeing the need for military victory in Katanga and facing another cessation in South Kasai, the main source of Congo's diamond riches, Lumumba took the fateful decision to ask the Soviet Union for immediate military assistance. With the support of the Soviet aircraft, trucks, crews and technicians, Lumumba planned to send a military force first to regain control in South Kasai and then to march on Elizabethville in Katanga to overthrow Moise Tshombe. At a meeting of the United States National Security Council 3 days later, President Eisenhower, when told by his advisors that Lumumba might succeed in forcing the United Nations to leave the Congo, authorized his CIA to eliminate Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba's military expedition to Kasai, meanwhile, resulted in the massacre of hundreds of Baluba tribesmen and the flight of 250,000 refugees. News of these atrocities in Kasai added to the alarm spreading among Lumumba's growing band of critics and opponents. Colonel Mobutu, now the army's chief of staff, fell out with Lumumba over the expedition and joined the ranks of his critics. As moves to oust Lumumba gathered momentum, the focus of attention turned to President Joseph Kasavubu. In a radio broadcast on 5 September 1960, President Joseph Kasavubu accused Patrice Lumumba of governing arbitrarily and plunging the Congo into civil war. He then announced that he had revoked his appointment as Prime Minister and appointed Joseph Ileyo, a widely respected moderate, in his place. Lumumba, however, was not so easily defeated. Upon hearing the news, he rushed to the radio station to make an announcement of his own. Lumumba announced that he had dismissed Joseph Kasavubu as president, accusing him of treason. The outcome of this whole fiasco was ultimately decided on the 14th of September. With the active encouragement of the United States CIA and the connivance of some United Nations official, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, the 29-year-old Army Chief of Staff who controlled the troops in Leopoldville, stepped forward and declared that he was neutralizing all politicians until the end of the year 1960. Colonel Mobutu assumed power himself and he then ordered the expulsion of all Russian and Czech personnel. The CIA station chief in the Congo, Lawrence Devlin, developed a particularly close relationship with Colonel Mobutu, providing him with funds to secure the loyalty of his troops. Now, in order to deal with issues of legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, Colonel Mobutu formed an interim government, retaining Joseph Kasavubu as president, but excluding all of Lumumba's supporters. Meanwhile, in October of 1960, Patrice Lumumba was placed under house arrest in Leopoldville. Lumumba continued to live at the Prime Minister's residence, a mansion situated on a bluff overlooking the Congo River, guarded by an inner ring of United Nations troops in the garden to prevent his arrest. Lumumba's house was also surrounded by an outer ring of Mobutu's soldiers on the perimeter to prevent his escape. The CIA, meanwhile, fearing that Lumumba might return to power, continued working on his assassination schemes. At a meeting of the US National Security Council on 21 September, the chief of the CIA stressed that Lumumba remained a grave danger as long as he was not disposed of. With this in mind, a senior CIA scientist, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, put together an assassination kit that included a poison designed to produce a disease indigenous to that area of Africa that could be fatal. But this poison reached its expiry date before Lawrence Devlin had worked out a scheme to infiltrate Lumumba's residence. The Belgians were also working on their own assassination schemes. United Nations officials in Leopoldville, well aware of how perilous and precarious Lumumba's position was, continued to warn him that they would only be able to provide him with protection if he remained in his residence. Now, when the United Nations General Assembly, under intensive American pressure, voted to recognize Kasavubu and Mobutu as the legitimate occupiers of the Congolese seat in the UN General Assembly, Patrice Lumumba knew that his time was running out, and so he tried to make a plan. On 25 November 1960, during a heavy tropical downpour, hidden in the back of a car, Patrice Lumumba secretly left the safety of his residence and set out to drum up support in the rest of the country on his way to his personal power base in Stanleyville. The United Nations force, which was not allowed to interfere in internal Congolese politics, was ordered neither to assist nor to interfere with Lumumba's progress or with the movements of his pursuers. Lumumba's decision to leave his residence turned out to be a fatal one. Colonel Mobutu's soldiers caught up with him at Mweka in the vast territory of Kasai.
Patrice Lumumba comes back to Leopoldville a prisoner. The former Congo premier, who was captured when he fled inland, wears the tuft of whiskers on his chin that helped to identify him. His arrest provoked several clashes between Lumumba followers and Congolese army troops.
Patrice Lumumba was imprisoned in the military camp at Thysville, halfway between Leopoldville and the Atlantic. Even in captivity, Lumumba's undoubted charisma made Joseph Kasavubu and Colonel Mobutu, and perhaps also the United States and Belgium, very worried. They were concerned that the soldiers in Thysville were sympathetic to him. While the United Nations Secretary General and his representatives demanded Lumumba's release, Joseph Kasavubu and Colonel Mobutu, with the help of their Belgian mentors, searched for a way to get rid of him for good. They came up with an essentially simple plan to hand him over to the Luba people of Kasai. The Luba wanted revenge for Lumumba's forces' disastrous foray into Kasai, which resulted in the deaths of many Luba people. The idea was to land Lumumba at Bakwanga in Kasai and let the Luba people do the rest. But at the last minute, the plotters found that the United Nations troops were in charge of the Bakwanga airfield. And so Patrice Lumumba and his two companions, Joseph Okito and Maurice Mpolo, were redirected to Elizabethville in Katanga. President Joseph Kasavubu telephoned the Katanga secessionist leader Moise Chombe to tell him that 3 parcels were on the way and that he would know what to do with them. On the aircraft, the specially picked Luba guards worked over their hated enemy with immense brutality. After landing at Elizabethville, the plane was directed to a remote corner of the airfield. At an isolated house in the bush, Katanga ministers and some Belgians subjected what was left of Lumumba to further beatings. The 3 men were then driven to a remote area, executed and buried in shallow graves. The next day the bodies were exhumed, cut up and dissolved in sulfuric acid. No identifiable trace of Lumumba and his companions remained. Patrice Lumumba was only 35 years old. It was only in June of 2022 that a tooth that had once belonged to Patrice Lumumba was returned to the now Democratic Republic of the Congo from Belgium. The announcement nearly a month later by Katanga's Minister of Interior that Lumumba had escaped and had been caught and killed by the people of a loyal village was universally disbelieved. This announcement triggered a violent worldwide reaction. Belgian and American embassies were attacked, and there was a riot in the spectators' gallery of the United Nations Security Council. Following his death, Patrice Lumumba became a national and African hero. To this day, especially for oppressed people, Lumumba stars as a martyr to colonialism and as a symbol for the fight against Western capitalism and greed. On Saturday, 17 May 1997, Laurent Kabilas forces seized power from Mobutu Sese Seko, marking the collapse of Zaire, the 32-year-old state which had been created by Mobutu out of the chaos of the original Congo. Zaire had been sustained with the help at different periods of Mobutu's Western allies, namely Belgium, the United States and France. Mobutu's departure as the leader of Zaire was one of the most significant events to shape post-colonial Africa, and various analysts say that Mobutu created his own downfall with a mixture of extreme greed and short-sightedness. Mobutu was unable to adjust to the changing reality of the post-Cold War era and regional politics. He had trouble accepting that the United States would shift its support from opponents of communism to advocates for democracy. Most importantly, Mobutu also miscalculated in thinking he could gain from supporting Hutu militiamen against Tutsi rulers in neighboring Rwanda. This move backfired and contributed to his eventual demise. Born Joseph Mobutu in Lisala, in the extreme northwest of the then Belgian Congo, on 14 October 1930, Mobutu went on to become a definitive figure in the Congo's post-colonial history. Like a number of first-generation African leaders, the army made Mobutu. After he enlisted in 1949, the army provided him with a means by which he could later dominate his fellow citizens. Mobutu also grew to know many of the leading Congolese politicians during the late 1950s, including Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Congo. In fact, Mobutu joined Lumumba's Movement National Congolais Party, the MNC. Mobutu's meteoric rise to power came during the Congo crisis of 1960 to 1964. When the Congo became independent on June 30, 1960, the coalition government of President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba appointed Mobutu the Secretary of State for National Defense, and he was responsible for the army. The army took on an important role in the Congo as it was tasked with preventing the cessation of the mineral-rich provinces of Katanga and Kasai. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in 1961, and his successors faced difficulties governing the Congo. In 1965, a constitutional crisis developed in which the Prime Minister Moise Tshombe and the President Joseph Kasavubu wrestled for power. In the midst of this deadlock, Mobutu launched a successful coup d'etat. After taking power, he quickly moved to ban political parties, having blamed politicians for the Congo's ills. Throughout all of this, Mobutu was a master manipulator, violent when necessary, yet also able to charm his enemies into eventually becoming his allies. Mobutu gradually established a dictatorial regime after eliminating many of his allies and enemies among the politicians and the military. The dictator acted as a king and sole owner of the Congo. In the early 1970s, he intensified his authenticity campaign in which the name of the Congo was changed to Zaire and the names of cities were changed to their supposedly original African names. At the same time, he shackled regional administrators and vested so much power on the presidency that he became the sole legislator. Above all, Mobutu's means of control was personal down to the finest detail. Everything went through him. Because he was fearful of military coups, he purged the army of competent officers, switched money from effective to inexperienced brigades, and constantly disrupted the military command structure. This is all while some of the troops were often left unpaid, resorting, like every other state employee, to theft. Mobutu's army was essentially made up mostly of individuals from one region, and it had no capacity to fight any rebels. This would later prove to be detrimental for the dictator. Early on, Mobutu did much to enrich himself and members of his inner circle. His regime was the epitome of kleptocratic rule and remains one of his lasting legacies to this very day. Greed sustained Mobutu. His bottomless funds allowed him to bribe the incorruptible, and it was his command over cash flow within the country rather than the military apparatus which kept him in power for so many years. The demand for base metals such as cobalt and copper, of which the Congo is well endowed, was spurred by the Vietnam War, and this boosted the Congolese economy between 1968 and 1974. The vast revenues from these resources should have enabled the government to move millions of Congolese out of poverty, but were instead used by Mobutu to bribe political allies in the country and abroad and to strengthen the hold of his party over the country. In November 1973, in a drive to create a national bourgeoisie, which in his own words would spur Zaire's development, Mobutu confiscated all small and medium-sized enterprises and handed them over to his cronies. This was indeed a turning point in the country's economic history. The beneficiaries of this policy by Mobutu had no experience nor any intention of running businesses and merely siphoned the businesses' available cash and let them rot. By 1974, most of the businesses had folded, and this started a downturn in the national economy from which the country never recovered. All of this was exacerbated by the rapid fall of commodity prices, which brought most of the Congo's revenue. As a result, hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs, and this raised the levels of unemployment in the country. The government lost revenue and thus the means to maintain infrastructure, which quickly deteriorated. The economic deterioration of Zaire was such that civil servants struggling to survive on the measly salaries turned to extortion, contributing further to a system of corruption that became deeply entrenched in Zaire. Mobutu's policy of nationalizing industries and handing out lucrative contracts to his allies proved catastrophic, so in 1976 Zaire accepted its first structural adjustment package. But as one industry after another crumbled and the regime defaulted on debts incurred by massive loans, Mobutu could perhaps sense an end in sight. The economic erosion in Zaire fueled the growth of a credible opposition in the early 1980s, which saw the beginning of a half-hearted transition into multi-party politics as a way by Mobutu to quell foreign and domestic pressure. But I'll touch on this a little bit later. Despite his disregard for democracy and proven human rights abuses, Mobutu enjoyed widespread support from the international community, particularly the United States, France and Belgium. Mobutu served as a bulwark against communism in the region, supporting UNITA rebels who were fighting against the communist MPLA regime in Angola. In fact, Zaire acted as a conduit for United States military aid to the UNITA guerrillas, which allowed Mobutu to act as a broker between UNITA and the Angolan government. Additionally, Mobutu's government's efforts to take on political and security roles in a region that was regarded as chronically unstable served as a justification for United States policymakers to support him. These efforts by Mobutu's government included Zaire's military interventions in the Central African Republic in 1979, in Burundi in 1972, and in Chad between 1981 and 1983. It is also worth mentioning that the soldiers that helped Mobutu crush rebellions in 1977 and 1978 were Moroccan, French, and Belgian. The fact that Zaire produced more than 70% of the world's cobalt may have had a lot to do with this. Following the end of the Cold War, Zaire lost both its strategic importance and the crucial international assistance that went with it. The old dictator Mobutu had outlived his usefulness to his former masters as a bulwark against communism in the region. Meanwhile, on the political front, in Zaire, discontent was mounting not only among the masses but also among the elites who had benefited from the regime. In 1980, in an unprecedented move, a group of about 13 members of parliament, led by Etienne Tshisekedi, wrote a letter to Mobutu denouncing the regime's mismanagement and the capture of the state by a clique and demanding political reforms. The reaction of the regime's repressive machine was swift and brutal. The members of parliament were all arrested and tortured, but this did not deter them. In 1982, in a show of exceptional courage and defiance of the law establishing a one-party state in Zaire, the MPs created a party, the Union for Democracy and Social Progress. Their struggle, combined with pressure from the regime's allies, forced Mobutu to accept multi-party democracy in April of 1990. The incumbent Secretary General of the Economic Community of Central African States was appointed head of a restructured transitional government that was installed on 4 May of that year, 1990. Over the next year, Zaire's constitution was revised to permit the formation of trade unions and at least 2 additional political parties. However, the euphoria generated by the prospect of a new political social order quickly evaporated as a result of Mobutu's continuing repression of opposition political activity. In particular, Mobutu's announcement that a limited multi-party system would not come into effect for at least 2 years led to a bloody confrontation at the University of Lubumbashi on May 11, 1990. Here, it was reported that security forces killed more than 50 student demonstrators. Eventually, Mobutu was persuaded by opposition pressure to announce on December 31 both presidential and legislative elections. They were scheduled to be held in 1991, as was a referendum on another new constitution. At the end of September 1991, under pressure from the opposition, Mobutu not only appointed as Prime Minister Etienne Tshisekedi, but he also agreed to the formation of an opposition-dominated cabinet and diminished presidential powers. In addition, a transitional constitution was adopted and it reinstalled the separation of powers and strengthened human and civil rights. In 1992, a sovereign national conference was convened to decide which form the new multi-party system would take. But rather than furthering the SNC's work, Mobutu successfully sowed division among the delegates and managed to stay in power. As you can probably imagine, Mobutu and his entourage did not want to relinquish power and lose all the privileges that they enjoyed. And so they did their very best to disrupt the running of the new government and then used military force to remove it from power. In fact, President Mobutu Sese Seko went on to dismiss Prime Minister Etienne Tshisekedi and his government illegally. Mobutu still retained the loyalty of the security forces and he managed to remain in power by a complex strategy that involved seemingly to agree to reforms but never implementing them. Repression of the opposition, instigation of mutinies in the armed forces, and the fueling of ethnic grievances, as well as the cooptation of prominent opposition leaders. Amid the ensuing economic and political crisis of 1991, Mobutu's army turned on the cities, taking by violence the goods left unstolen after the leader's years of taking by stealth. Following this looting by the soldiers, the civilians followed suit. Shops, offices and factories were trashed and millions of dollars were stolen. This exercise was repeated in some towns in 1993, and it is alleged that on both occasions Mobutu had encouraged the rampage by the army. By 1993, such was the conflict between pro- and anti-Mobutu forces that there was a duplication of political institutions in Zaire. There were 2 governments, 2 parliaments, and 2 currencies. This political stalemate was finally overcome at the end of the year when the 2 legislators merged into the Transitional High Council of the Republic, the HCR. But unlike the previous National Conference, pro-Mobutu forces dominated the HCR. Mobutu Sese Seko, the quintessential Machiavellian operator, cleverly played the opposition parties against each other to maintain his grip on power. 7 prime ministers came and went during what became a 7-year transition, and many of the opposition parties were actually pro-Mobutu fronts. In the confusion, he cast himself as the only unifying political force in Zaire. But with the fall of the Cold War, the United States lost tolerance for Mobutu's resistance to democracy, and along with other Western countries, they cut off aid. In June of 1994, Zaire was suspended from the IMF and its collapse deepened. When the politicians were arguing in Kinshasa, trouble was mounting on the eastern fringes of the country. In fact, from April 1994, because of the genocide in Rwanda and the war that ensued, close to 1 million Rwandese refugees crossed the border into the eastern Zairean provinces of North and South Kivu. At first, Mobutu sought to use the arrival of Rwandan Hutu and Tutsi refugees in his country to ingratiate himself once more to the international community, not only as a Cold War ally but also as a humanitarian. Yet his strategy collapsed in the face of Rwandan opposition to his hosting of these refugees on Zaire's eastern border. This refugee crisis was the ultimate cause of his fall. Some of the refugees that had crossed over into Zaire fomented local ethnic strife, joining with local Hutus to drive Tutsis out of eastern Zaire and also using the refugee camps as bases to attack Rwanda. Now, Mobutu had miscalculated and underestimated the drive for survival of Rwanda's new leaders. In October 1996, Rwanda and Uganda invaded eastern Zaire. They recruited Congolese proxies who acted as rebels and as a front for this invasion. The leaders in these 2 countries used Mobutu's longtime opponent Laurent Désiré Kabila to front a movement called the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo. These forces would eventually dethrone Mobutu. A former Lumumbist and Marxist, considered unpromising revolutionary material by Che Guevara, Laurent Kabila's 30 years in the political wilderness made him a little-known figure, but one who, unlike more prominent leaders of the Zairean opposition, was in no way compromised by association with Mobutu or acceptance of political reward from him. On 24 October 1996, Kabila's campaign began. At first, the French, one of Mobutu's major allies, wanted to step in to rescue him. However, the Americans blocked the idea, saying that foreign forces should stay out of Zaire. Initially, Zaireans reckoned that Laurent Désiré Kabila was heading an invasion of Tutsis from Rwanda, and so they looked to their leader, Mobutu, to drive him back. When Mobutu returned from France, where he was getting treatment, in December of 1996, he was cheered by the masses. At this point, it looked as if Mobutu would outwit his enemies and work on a strategy to fully retain power. In this regard, he changed the army command. But unfortunately, all of this was to no avail. His troops kept on losing against Kabila's forces. This time around, it was clear for all to see that the end was near. Town after town fell to Kabila's rebellion. On 19 April, the rebel forces captured Lubumbashi, and it was only a matter of time until Kinshasa, the capital, fell. Mobutu's demoralized and ill-equipped army hardly fought the invaders. Mobutu had lost control of the situation. Ailing and weak, he was confronted with the fact that he could not muster up his divided and unpaid army to mount a credible defense against Kabila. In the final stages of the split, Kabila's troops were joined by the Angolan army, which seized the opportunity to flush out Angolan rebels who were using Zaire as their base. The bulk of the forces loyal to him were concentrated in and around Kinshasa. These included some 3,000 soldiers of the Division Special Presidential, the DSP, as well as several thousand UNITA soldiers, along with former members of the Rwandan army and the Hutu militia. This was the setting for the intense diplomatic efforts that were undertaken by special American envoys along with South African President Nelson Mandela and his Vice President Thabo Mbeki in attempting to set up a meeting for Mobutu Sese Seko and Laurent Kabila to negotiate. Under pressure, Mobutu and Kabila met for the first time aboard the SAS Otanika on 4 May 1997 off the coast of Pointe-Noire in the Republic of the Congo. These negotiations were presided over by Nelson Mandela himself. However, nothing of consequence came out of this meeting. A second meeting that was set for 14 May had to be cancelled when Mobutu was left waiting in vain for Laurent Kabila's arrival. The only reason for the diplomatic efforts was to convince Mobutu to yield power little by little in order to avoid bloodshed and so that Laurent Kabila's forces could enter Kinshasa without fighting. On May 13, the government declared a curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. while the opposition parties announced a general strike for May 15 and May 16, calling upon the citizens to stay home to avoid a bloodbath. On Thursday, May 15, three top generals, General Likolia, General Mahele and General Nzimbi, respectively Prime Minister, Minister of Defense and head of Mobutu's DSP, met 3 times with Mobutu to inform him that they could not defend Kinshasa and to encourage him to relinquish power. On Friday, May 16, Mobutu Sese Seko abandoned power and took refuge in his palace at Badolite while still holding on to his title of head of state. On Saturday, May 17, Kabila's AFDL soldiers entered Kinshasa without fighting. They were warmly welcomed by a population happy to finally rid itself of the reign of terror which had left it weak and drained. On the morning of the same day, Laurent Desire Kabila proclaimed himself President of the Republic and took complete authority over the transition. Following his departure from Kinshasa on May 16, Mobutu Sese Seko did not even have the time to catch his breath at his palace in Badolite. On Sunday, May 18, he was forced to flee in haste to Lome, the capital of Togo, when AFDL forces threatened to take over the region's airport. From Lome in Togo, where his friend Nassimbe Eyadema found his presence to be an embarrassment, Mobutu later fled to Rabat, Morocco, where he died of prostate cancer on 7 September 1997. It's been over 20 years since the assassination of the DRC's former president, Laurent Desire Kabila, at the hands of his child soldiers. Kabila was the leader of the rebellion that overthrew President Mobutu of Zaire in 1997 and restored the country's name. What many don't know about him is how he spent most of his life in exile, engaged in the illegal gold and diamond trade, as well as wild schemes to overthrow the dictatorship of Mobutu, his immediate predecessor. Along the way, he briefly recruited Che Guevara in 1965, as well as the armies of Uganda and Rwanda, which helped bring him to power in 1997. Laurent Desire Kabila was born in the province of Katanga, a part of what was then Belgian Congo. This was in 1939. He completed his studies in high school in Elizabethville, now Lubumbashi, in the DRC, and then studied political philosophy at a French university. It is also said that Kabila attended the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. In 1960, when he was 21 years old, Kabila became a leader in the political movements allied to the first Prime Minister of independent Congo, Patrice Lumumba. At the dawn of Congo's independence from Belgium, the young Kabila was one of the bright young men who may have become a star in his country's politics at the time. Yet after the United Nations intervention and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the cream of these young Congolese politicians were exiled. The army also chased Kabila and other communist sympathizers away into the bush, where they formed a guerrilla force. These young Congolese then formed a rebellion which was then backed by both the Chinese and the Russians and a half dozen other African countries. The rebellion by this group of fighters, including Kabila, attracted the attention of the United States. The United States was panicking about possible Soviet gains in newly independent Africa. The Americans recruited Belgian officers, exiled Cuban pilots, as well as foreign mercenaries. Forced to retreat, Kabila and his friends turned to the Cubans and Che Guevara for support. So Che Guevara and his squad arrived on the Tanzanian-Congo border with a small contingent of guerrilla fighters. This was in April of 1965. However, in his diary that was published in 1999, Che Guevara noted Laurent Kabila's lack of involvement in the party and the general lack of organization in the group. Guevara judged Kabila, who was 26 years at the time, as not being the man of the hour and that Kabila was too distracted. This, in Guevara's opinion, accounted for Kabila showing up days late at times to provide supplies, aid or backup to Guevara's men. Guevara also discovered, to his dismay, that Kabila was given to drinking traditional potions that he believed would protect him from bullets, and sometimes Kabila also turned up quite drunk. The revolt of the rebels that were led by Kabila was suppressed in 1965 by the Congolese army with support from the United States. Mobutu took control of the nation in 1965, established a dictatorship, and in 1971 renamed the country Zaire. In 1967, Kabila founded the People's Revolutionary Party, fighting to establish a self-sufficient Marxist territory in the eastern section of Zaire. This group carved out an enclave on Lake Tanganyika in the distant Kivu province. There, Kabila's rebels supported themselves by killing elephants, trading in ivory, as well as gold mining. They also received occasional help and funding from China and Cuba. But Kabila's rebels also gained international notoriety in 1975 when they kidnapped 2 American students and 1 Dutch researcher for ransom. Mobutu, who was now firmly in control of the country, ordered his troops into the region, and they managed to suppress Kabila's forces, who had no choice but to relocate to Tanzania, where they regrouped. In the 1970s, Kabila moved his family to Tanzania after years of leading the unsuccessful rebel movement in Congo. At that point in time, Laurent Desire Kabila was a wanted man, and the Kabila family would go on to live discreetly in exile in Uganda and Tanzania. While in Tanzania, Kabila's family members used assumed names, often versions of one of Laurent Kabila's pseudonyms, Francis Mtwale, and ran several small businesses, including restaurants, bars, and markets. Kabila and his family imported food and imported and exported other commodities from the Congo through the ports in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The family was protected by the Tanzanian government and moved from house to house in the city's affluent neighborhoods to escape detection by Mobutu's intelligence agents. In 1979, when the Ugandan exiles, supported by Tanzania, decided to overthrow Idi Amin Dada, Kabila was incorporated by the Tanzanian troops among several armed groups to get a first-hand experience of modern warfare. According to Ugandan exiles, Kabila stayed in Uganda and became close to the group of Yoweri Museveni until they went to the bush in 1980. In Kabila and Museveni's first meeting, Kabila is said to have asked for arms in order to attack Mobutu, but was given a condition, which was not to operate on the Uganda-Congo border. Unfortunately for Kabila, the arms deal fell through, but Museveni gave Kabila a modest financial contribution and linked him with Libya to see if they could assist in any way without involving Uganda. Meanwhile in Tanzania, Kabila would have a falling out with the then Tanzanian president, Julius Nyerere, because of their disagreement over Kabila's lifestyle. Nyerere criticized Kabila for being too autocratic in his guerrilla movement and being too involved in illicit business activities, which later led to Kabila being cut off for contacts with the Tanzanian security services. At the time, by 1985, while Kabila was living in Dar es Salaam, He had been involved in smuggling gold and diamonds as well as timber on Lake Tanganyika. His other businesses included running a bar as well as a brothel in Tanzania. After all of this drama, Kabila disappeared from the public view for the next 15 years and did not re-emerge until 1994. So Kabila only surfaced again in 1994 when the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the RPF, took power in Rwanda. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni introduced Kabila to the then Rwandan Vice President, Paul Kagame, who had a sharp conflict with President Mobutu. Kagame was cross with Mobutu over the presence of Rwandan refugees on the Rwandan-Congo border who were being held hostage by Interahamwe militias who were Hutu militiamen that had led the genocide back in Rwanda, as well as elements of the former Rwandan army and the former Rwandan government. The presence of the Interahamwe in Congo, as well as Mobutu's continuing support for his old Hutu allies, sowed the seeds of much of the upheaval that was to come and the Zairean leaders' own downfall. The Interahamwe and former Rwandan government officials used the refugee camps in the Congo as bases to launch attacks against the new government in Rwanda. By 1996, Rwanda decided that it could no longer tolerate the refugee camps. The Tutsi of South Kivu in Zaire, who were called the Banyamulenge, staged an uprising in the summer of 1996 against Mobutu's government. This was with support from the government in Rwanda. By the second half of 1996, the alliance of the Banyamulenge, as well as the Tutsi of North Kivu, Kabila's rebels, Rwanda, Uganda and Angola, formed to overthrow Mobutu. The alliance appointed Laurent Desire Kabila as the spokesperson and the then leader of the coalition, and the coalition was called the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo-Zaire, the AFDL. So here are the reasons why the different countries and the different groups supported Kabila. Uganda apparently supported him as a means of eliminating Ugandan opposition groups on the Congo-Zaire border and perhaps to also punish Mobutu. And in the case of Rwanda, as I said earlier, they wished to eliminate the Hutu refugee forces in Zaire and perhaps to punish Mobutu. The Angolan government, meanwhile, was motivated by a wish to punish Mobutu as well as to strike a blow against its opponents, who were the separatist groups in the Congo, as well as Jonas Savimbi's UNITA. So Kabila was chosen as the spokesperson and the leader of the coalition, probably in part because he was the oldest among the founders of the AFDL, but more importantly, he had a long history of anti-Mobutu protests going back to the 1960s. The alliance also had support from the Kadogos, which is Swahili for child soldiers, from the eastern part of the country. One of the co-founders of the alliance was another Congolese politician called Kisase Ngandu. Kisase Ngandu had been the chief of the National Council of Resistance for Democracy, which was a group opposed to Mobutu and to whom many of the Kadogos belonged. As a result, most of the Kadogos were loyal to their leader, Kisase Ngandu, and this point is important for the latter part of the story, which involves the death of Laurent Kabila. We will talk about this later. So even before the forces of the alliance reached Kinshasa in May of 1997, certain elements of their policies as well as leadership styles began to emerge. Almost from the start of their military campaign, the alliance attempted to forge a new morality for the average Congolese citizen. The new morality policy involved, for example, whipping drunkards or women whose skirts were too short. The alliance also created a mechanism of local control which was similar to totalitarian systems, with the formation of the so-called Chembe, who were street-by-street committees that were set up to both inform and watch ordinary citizens. With time, the leadership of the alliance became divided. Initially, the leadership of the AFDL was supposed to be collegial, with Kabila only being the spokesperson. But when he started calling himself the president of the alliance, other leaders are reported to have objected, especially Kisase Ngandu, who I spoke about earlier. Unfortunately for Kisase Ngandu, Kabila felt threatened by him and so consolidated his power base by organizing Kisase Ngandu's assassination. It is said that this assassination displeased the Kadogos, and this might have been the reason why they eventually assassinated Kabila in 2001. Meanwhile, with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, Mobutu had lost so much of the Western financial support that they had provided in return for his intervention in the affairs of Zaire's neighbors. Marginalized by the new multi-party system in Zaire, as well as EU health, Mobutu finally relinquished control of the government in May of 1997 to Laurent Kabila and his forces. Mobutu died in exile a short time later. When the AFDL forces took control of Kinshasa on 17 May 1997, they were initially met with an enthusiastic welcome. Kabila would go on to be sworn in as the president of the newly renamed Democratic Republic of the Congo on the 31st of May 1997 and officially commenced his term as president. However, after perhaps one of the shortest honeymoons any victorious revolutionary leader has enjoyed, Kabila found his policies being challenged and his association with his foreign supporters, especially the Rwandan government, being viewed with suspicion. During his presidency, Kabila also went on to suspend the constitution. Some people saw him as a new breed of leadership, while others saw him as a continuation of the authoritarianism and corruption that he was supposedly replacing. Kabila wouldn't allow people to form the political parties that they wanted to form, and the elections that he had promised for April of 1999 became a distant dream. Kabila retained power to throw into prison those who dared to demand that he fulfill his promises, and he used this power very often. He also placed his leading opponent, Etienne Tshisekedi, under house arrest. However, in May of 1998, Kabila authorized a legislative assembly. During this supposed period of political liberalization, his opponents continued to be arrested. So it came as no surprise when in August of 1998, some of the groups in the eastern Congo that helped place Kabila in power began to oppose him and began a rebellion against his government, accusing it of numerous human rights abuses, including large-scale massacres of civilians, as well as the president's apparent favoritism towards his own ethnic group for political posts. Furthermore, his former national allies, Uganda and Rwanda, began supporting these rebels after Kabila's forces invaded both Uganda and Rwanda in pursuit of guerrilla fighters. Kabila, however, found new allies in Angola, Zimbabwe and Namibia, all of whom sent troops into the Congo in order to support Kabila's repression. All of this was the genesis of the Second Congo War, which devastated the country, with its effect still being felt across the DRC. For Laurent Desire Kabila, his survival skills served him well in exile, but deserted him once he had moved into the presidential palace. Rather, Kabila's Kadogos, that I mentioned earlier, were the ones that pulled the trigger that led to their boss's death. It is said that the Kadogos believed that Kabila had betrayed them. Kabila had believed that the Kadogos, who had served him loyally since his rebellion in 1997 against Mobutu, were utterly loyal. He even told a visiting foreign businessman that, and I quote, "They will never do anything against me. They have been with me since the beginning. They are my children." However, he overestimated their loyalty. Some of the Kadogos that had marched in support of Kabila in 1997 had never pardoned him for killing their former leader, Kisa Sengandu. One of them is quoted saying, "I marched with Kabila, but I knew he was a traitor." So the plot to kill Kabila started in early January of 2001, when a dissident group of the Kadogos went to Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo and drew up a document setting out Operation Bongo Zero. Bongo is a Swahili word for buffalo, a reference to Kabila's physical stature. It is said that the plan was that the conspirators would infiltrate strategic positions in Kinshasa, the capital of the DRC, including the presidential palace, the national radio and television station, and the headquarters of the country's electricity company. The whole plot involved some 75 members of Kabila's bodyguards at the presidential palace, many of whom were arrested after the killing. Of course, there was a hidden force supporting them, but there are many theories as to whom that may have been. The day before Kabila's assassination, he had witnessed the execution of 47 Kadogos, all believed to have been plotting against him. So here is a version of the events that transpired on that fateful night of 16 January 2001. It is said that Kabila's young killer entered the president's office at the Marble Palace in Kinshasa as the increasingly paranoid and isolated Kabila was discussing with an economics advisor about a looming summit with France. The assassin bent over Kabila, and the president, assuming the teenager wanted to talk to him, leaned towards him. The Kadogo then produced a revolver and shot the president 4 times and then escaped with other conspirators while the palace resounded with gunfire. At least 3 of those involved in the plot, including the unnamed killer himself, fled Kinshasa and may have gone into hiding in Brazzaville, the capital of the neighboring Congo. 2 days later, Congolese officials announced Kabila's death. Afterwards, his son, Joseph Kabila, then aged 28, became the next president of the country. On January 16, 2001, the Democratic Republic of the Congo tumbled into uncertainty. The country's president, Laurent Désiré Kabila, had been sitting in his office at his Marble Palace in Kinshasa, the capital, when one of his bodyguards entered, drew his pistol, aimed it at Kabila, and fired several times. The news broadcast then reviewed his successor as being his 29-year-old son, Joseph Kabila, who had yet to make a name for himself. The young Kabila was a shy man of a few words and was a mystery unknown to foreign diplomats and the Congolese public alike. Yet, having marched across the country as part of his father's AFDL forces as they toppled Mobutu's government, he enjoyed legitimacy among the military and his father's close confidants, hence why they chose him to be his father's successor. Young Joseph Kabila inherited a country that was going through an intractable war, a near void of civil institutions, and a legacy of human rights abuses committed under the rules of his father Laurent Kabila as well as the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. The young leader Joseph Kabila had his work cut out for him. This is the story of Joseph Kabila's rise to power as well as his 18-year reign of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Joseph Kabila Kabange's origins, including his parentage and place and date of birth, are the subject of persistent controversy, and without an irrefutable birth certificate, the rumors and many conspiracies about Joseph Kabila's origins have never ceased. Joseph Kabila and his twin sister Janet were born around the 4th of June 1971 to Laurent Désiré Kabila and their mother Sifa Maanya in Ankoro, a small town on the banks of the Congo River in North Katanga. There are some reports that instead he was born on 4 December 1971 at Hewa Bora, which was Laurent Kabila's guerrilla headquarters in the Fizi territory of South Kivu in the DRC. His mother Sifa Maanya was one of Laurent Kabila's 3 wives. She was a member of the Bangu tribe in the Maniema province of eastern Congo, although some people have claimed that she was a Tutsi from Rwanda. For years, many of Joseph Kabila's detractors argued that he was in fact a foreigner. This accusation even dogged Joseph Kabila many years later. Most notably, leader of the opposition Etienne Tshisekedi even accused Joseph of not being Laurent Kabila's legitimate son. The late Etienne Tshisekedi argued that Joseph was in fact of Rwandan origin, an accusation that carried some significance in a country that was still reeling from an invasion of Rwandan forces in what came to be known the Congo Wars. Laurent Kabila moved his family to Tanzania in the 1970s after years of leading an unsuccessful rebel movement in Fizi, South Kivu against Zairean dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. At this point, Laurent Kabila was a wanted man, and so the Kabila family lived discreetly in exile in Uganda and Tanzania. In order to avoid the attention of Mobutu's intelligence service, they pretended to be members of the Fipa people, a small ethnic group from southwest Tanzania. The Kabilas did not grow up rich. During a trip to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, Laurent Kabila was stranded in Moscow, unable to afford the airfare home. His wife Sifa, Joseph's mother, sold vegetables in Tanzania. People who knew Joseph Kabila from that time described him as an intelligent, sporty young man who was passionate about cars and had a great admiration for revolutionary heroes like Thomas Sankara, Che Guevara, and Yoweri Museveni. Joseph Kabila received his primary and secondary education in Tanzania, attending schools based on the British school system where he learned to speak English at a young age. He was also fluent in Swahili, although not in Lingala, which is the language spoken in Congo's capital, Kinshasa. After completing primary and secondary school, young Joseph Kabila trained in the Rwandan military for 3 years before he went on to continue his education. Joseph Kabila had just begun university in Uganda in 1996 when his father called him to help in the rebel war against then-President Mobutu Sese Seko. In this period between 1996 and 1997, which came to be known as the First Congo War, Laurent Désiré Kabila headed the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, the AFDL, which was the rebel group that wanted to put an end to Mobutu Sese Seko's dictatorship in Zaire. Mobutu had been in power since 1965. During this war, Joseph Kabila worked alongside a prominent Rwandan figure, James Kabarebe, who at the time was chief military strategist in Laurent Kabila's rebel AFDL. James Kabarebe wanted young Joseph, who was then 25 years, to take part in military operations led by the AFDL forces on Congolese soil with the support of the Rwandan army. Kabarebe said of his protege that Joseph Kabila had the hardest time learning how to fight. Behind Laurent Kabila's AFDL stood the firepower, troops and diplomatic council of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, Uganda's National Resistance Movement, and Angola's MPLA, but also that of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, as well as the Burundian and Tanzanian governments. The members of this coalition of liberation movements each had their own motives for wanting to topple Mobutu. This coalition sealed the fate of Mobutu, and Laurent Désiré Kabila announced in May of 1997 from Lubumbashi that he was assuming the presidency of the republic. Following the AFDL's victory and Laurent Désiré Kabila's rise to the presidency, young Joseph Kabila went on to get further training at the PLA National Defense University in Beijing, China. Meanwhile, the help that Laurent Kabila had received from the various nations came with strings attached, namely from two of his so-called friends, Rwandan President Paul Kagame and Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. However, the Congolese people felt profound resentment over the Rwandan and Ugandan presence and influence in their country. This resentment by the Congolese prompted Laurent Kabila to reconsider his relations with his former friends. In July of 1998, amid deteriorating relations with Rwanda, President Kabila dismissed the Rwandan General James Kabarebe from his position as Army Chief of Staff and ordered Rwandan soldiers to leave the DRC. In turn, Kabila's refusal to satisfy the expectations of his former Rwandan and Ugandan friends prompted the Second Congo War. In the following months, the DRC was divided into two zones, one led by Laurent Kabila with support of the armed forces of Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, Chad and Sudan, and the other controlled by the armed wing of what was known as the RCD, the Rwandan Army, the Ugandan Army, and the Burundian Army. In addition to these forces, a group called the MLC led by Jean-Pierre Bemba and the RCD-KML occupied other parts of the country. The Second Congo War precipitated Joseph Kabila's return to the Congo in August of 1998 when he was appointed General Major and Chief of Staff of the Congolese Army at the age of 27. His rapid promotion was surprising to many considering the very short time he had spent in the military. In the year 2000, Joseph Kabila became Chief of Staff of the Land Forces and was one of the main military commanders during the Second Congo War. Joseph Kabila's life changed dramatically in the beginning of 2001. On January 16 of that year, his father Laurent Kabila had been sitting in his office at his marble palace in Kinshasa when one of his bodyguards shot him several times. Following this incident, Laurent Kabila's advisors scrambled to react. Keeping news of the attack from the public, they arranged for his dead body to be flown to Zimbabwe under the guise of him getting treatment. Congo's borders were sealed, its airports shut down, and a curfew announced. When it became apparent that Laurent Kabila's gunshot wounds were fatal, his close allies, in consultation with several other members of the presidential cabinet, met in order to decide on a successor. They settled on his son Joseph as the only person who could hold together various government and military factions. At that point, there had been a lot of bad blood between senior government officials, and so appointing Joseph Kabila was the path of least resistance. In other words, this was an appointment that everyone could get behind. Joseph Kabila Kabange was just 29 years old and hardly had any experience. His only civilian work experience lay in doing odd jobs for his father and driving a taxi. For this group of Laurent Kabila's advisors and associates, selling their choice to other power brokers was not easy. Other military commanders also had to be convinced. But this wasn't as difficult since Joseph was well known and generally respected within the military. An unexpected obstacle was Joseph Kabila's initial reluctance to accept the offer. When his father's advisors asked him to become president, it is said that he was initially very resistant to the idea, most likely because he feared for his life. He eventually relented and accepted the proposal. And so on January 27, 2001, 11 days after his father's death, Joseph Kabila became the president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and at the time the youngest head of state in the world. The Congolese did not know what to expect from their new president. They did not know if he was strong enough to hold the country together or whether he could pursue war or peace. Also at the time, many people were unhappy with the way Joseph Kabila had come to power. They objected to the fact that he was chosen secretly and automatically. Others disapproved of the choice because they were unhappy with his father's record as a leader. They also believed that Joseph was easily influenced and a puppet to his father's advisors. Whatever the case, when Joseph Kabila became president, the country faced many challenges. As I already alluded to, almost half of the national territory was occupied by the armies of neighboring countries which had their own plans for the Congo. Despite this complicated state of affairs, Joseph Kabila was no pushover. He displayed a strong will and he understood that remaining in power could not be left to chance. Immediately upon inheriting the presidency, he made surprising decisions that diverged completely from his father's. Among other things, he dismissed his father's former advisors and allies. Joseph Kabila also began the normalization of bilateral relations with key allies such as the United States, France, Britain and Belgium, among others. His trip to France, the US and Belgium, hardly a week after his rise to power, increased his legitimacy both at home and abroad. The words that he uttered were well received, and so he was given the benefit of the doubt. In his speeches, Joseph Kabila referred to the need to restore peace and consolidate national communion, the relaunching of the Lusaka Peace Accord, the return to democratic life, and the opening up of the political system. Joseph Kabila also spoke about the need to organize an inter-Congolese dialogue as well as the liberalization of the economy. Kabila also held talks with rebel groups and the governments of 5 countries, namely Rwanda, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Angola and Namibia, that had troops in Congo. Political talks also took place between Congolese actors in Lusaka, Zambia, as well as in Pretoria and Sun City in South Africa. In a meeting in Zambia in February of 2001, Joseph Kabila agreed to begin the implementation of a ceasefire agreement that had been signed in July of 1999 but had not been honored. In December of 2002, Joseph Kabila was a signatory to an agreement with rebels to end the war and to form a power-sharing transitional government. This agreement, known as the Global and Inclusive Agreement, was signed on December 16, 2002. Based on the deal, the parties agreed to combine their efforts in order to achieve national reconciliation. To this effect, they decided to set up a government of national unity, which would eventually organize free and democratic elections after a period of transition, the duration of which was fixed. The power-sharing agreement kept Joseph Kabila as interim president with 4 vice presidents, one representing the government, one the rebel group RCD Goma, another the MLC of Jean-Pierre Bemba, and another for the civil society. This agreement was ratified in April of 2003. United Nations peacekeepers arrived in DR Congo at the end of March 2003 to monitor the ceasefire and the pullback of troops. Though Joseph Kabila made strides towards peace, his actions were not without opposition. For instance, in 2004, there were alleged coup attempts against him. In one of these attempts, members of an elite unit that guarded him took charge of state radio. Major Eric Lenge of the Presidential Guard, who was said to be the leader of the group, announced on the radio that the country's transitional process was not working and that he was suspending it and taking control himself. Fortunately for Joseph Kabila, his loyalist forces prevailed and crushed the coup d'etat. Undeterred, Joseph Kabila continued in his attempts to unify the country. Back in 2001, when Joseph Kabila took over, the economy was in a disastrous state, with no growth, infrastructure broken, rapid inflation, and a tanking currency. Soon after assuming office, Joseph Kabila called in the World Bank, the IMF, and Western donors to the Congo. The initial results of his reforms, at least, were impressive. Inflation and the value of the Congolese franc stabilized, and new investment flowed into the mining, telecommunications, construction, and infrastructure sectors. Although the DRC's development indicators remained below the African average, there was significant progress with increases in life expectancy and school enrollment and a dramatic fall in childhood mortality. Economic indicators also improved under Joseph Kabila's rule, although they remained far below the country's potential. However, the key challenge was to diversify the Congolese economy, since most of the growth was still too reliant on mining. Unfortunately, corruption was also rife in the DRC, and Joseph Kabila and his family were accused of being the top perpetrators of corruption in the country, as well as abusing power to enrich themselves. It is alleged that the most egregious form of corruption involved Joseph Kabila and his family. For instance, an organization known as the Congo Research Group published a report in collaboration with Bloomberg News that exposed the elaborate web of businesses that the president and his relatives constructed in Congo. The report showed that the Kabilas had their fingers in everything from farming and mining to aviation and construction. This report also alleged that many Kabila-linked businesses received special treatment. For example, there were mines that were protected by presidential guards. There was even a company with links to the Kabila family that was said to have gotten $60 of the $185 fee for each new Congolese passport. The Panama Papers that were published beginning of April 3, 2016 revealed that Kabila's twin sister, Janet, using a different name, owned an indirect share in the nation's largest mobile phone operator, and this was through a company registered in the South Pacific Islands. Another investigation titled The Congo Hold-Up, which was conducted by international media and NGOs, accused Joseph Kabila and his family of having siphoned at least $138 million from state coffers. These alleged embezzlements took place from 2013 to 2018, according to the authors of this investigation. The main actor was alleged to be Kabila's brother, Francis Silemani. It is said that Silemani purchased numerous luxury homes in the United States and South Africa, in part using funds diverted from the Congolese government. However, none of the documents to emerge from most of these scandals have Joseph Kabila's signatures on them, though the names of his top aides and companies of his associates are all over them. As part of the peace process that ended the war in 2003, the DR Congo created a new political system. The various rebel leaders rebranded their militias as political parties and exchanged their military fatigues for suits. A new constitution was drafted. Powerful international and national backers, including United States diplomats in Kinshasa, enabled Joseph Kabila to thwart Jean-Pierre Bemba, who was president of the MLC, in his quest to become the president in the 2006 elections. Veteran politician Etienne Tshisekedi's party boycotted the elections and remained outside the institutions and continued to play a role as an opposition party. This 2006 presidential election was generally regarded as free and fair. Jean-Pierre Bemba was subsequently arrested in Belgium and brought before the International Criminal Court. Maybe one day I'll do a video on Jean-Pierre Bemba. Joseph Kabila stood for re-election in 2011, facing 10 other candidates in the poll that was scheduled for November 28 of that year. His strongest challenger was Etienne Tshisekedi. Kabila's re-election bid was bolstered by his well-organized political campaign, as well as a January 2011 constitutional amendment that eliminated the second round of voting in the presidential race, therefore allowing a candidate to win without necessarily having a majority of the vote. However, many Congolese were disgruntled over Kabila's failure to keep all of his 2006 election campaign promises, and so Etienne Tshisekedi was a popular opposition figure with considerable support. The political climate leading up to the election was tense and punctuated with violence because of tensions between the parties, as well as legitimate concerns that the logistical challenges would interfere with voting in remote parts of the country. Nonetheless, the elections were held as scheduled, and provisional results showed that Kabila was a winner with 49% of the vote. Tshisekedi followed with 32%. However, several international monitoring groups characterized the polls as being poorly organized and noted many irregularities. International observers even reported that some districts had impossibly high turnout rates of more than 99% and that hundreds of thousands of ballots had disappeared.
We wanted to organize perfect elections. Did we attain that perfection? Not 100%. Were there mistakes, errors? Definitely. Definitely. Like in any other election, be it on the continent or otherwise.
For his part, the Archbishop of Kinshasa declared that the results of the Electoral Commission conformed neither to truth nor justice. Indeed, Joseph Kabila's proclamation as winner of the presidential elections raised the questions of his legitimacy and plunged the Congo into a grave constitutional crisis. But the results were confirmed by the Supreme Court, and Joseph Kabila was inaugurated on 20 December 2011. In the years that followed, Joseph Kabila was the target of protests when there were suspicions as early as 2013 that he would not step down at the end of his term in late 2016 and would instead try to find a way to extend his time in office. This suspicion was confirmed when 3 years before the scheduled vote, he pushed for an amendment to the constitution that would do away with the 2-term limit, but this bid by Joseph Kabila failed, and it triggered defections from Kabila's ruling coalition. His allies then proposed a time-consuming national census that would push back the date of the vote. But that failed as well, and Kabila turned to more creative means. In 2015, for example, the government announced that the Congo's 11 provinces would be split into 26, which had the effect of weakening rival politicians and diverting resources from elections. Suspicions against Kabila were bolstered even further after the Constitutional Court ruled in May 2016 that in the event that the elections were delayed, Joseph Kabila would remain in office until a successor could be elected and installed. Months later, the court granted a request from the Electoral Commission to postpone the 2016 elections. One of the reasons cited for delaying these elections was the logistical obstacles associated with holding the elections. A presidential election was eventually scheduled for December 23, 2018, and after years of speculation about Joseph Kabila's intentions, it was confirmed that he would not be standing in the election and would instead support the candidacy of Emmanuel Ramazani Shadary. Although the elections were held in most parts of the country and in generally peaceful conditions, there were problems reported regarding the voting process and tabulation of the votes. When the results were announced a week and a half later, Felix Tshisekedi, the son of Etienne Tshisekedi, who had died in 2017, was declared the winner, followed closely by Martin Fayulu, another opposition candidate. Shadary came in third. Thereafter, Martin Fayulu and others accused Felix Tshisekedi and Joseph Kabila of having made a deal to secure the former's election victory in exchange for protecting the interests of the latter and his associates. However, representatives of both Tshisekedi and Kabila denied the accusations. Martin Fayulu challenged the results at the Constitutional Court, but the court upheld Tshisekedi's victory. Joseph Kabila Kabange stepped down on January 24, 2019, handing power to Felix Tshisekedi, the first peaceful transition of power in Congo since the country became independent in 1960. This marked the end of Joseph Kabila's